which is I will be trying to highlight the intersection between the queer population and also the climate emergency that we are today. After all, ReportOUT, strongly believes in the idea of in promoting and ensuring that the different queer populations around the world are well protected, and that that's why we're doing a lot of different initiatives on the end, on my other colleagues' end as well. So a concept that I came about is the idea of queer environmentalism, is that there's actually a need to recognize the disproportionate impact of environmental issues on marginalized communities, including BIPOC, disabled queer, and so many more. I personally think that we cannot just be ignore and feel that climate change or climate emergency will affect everyone equally. I think that's not the case at all, and we have to acknowledge it and therefore do something about it. Because I think it doesn't make sense to just think that emergency would just affect everyone equally. So what queer environmentalism, the definition of it actually shares, is that it actually represents an intersectional perspective within the environmental activism space. That basically what it does is that it acknowledges the intertwined history of LGBTQIA+ rights movements and the environmental protection. I think that's why I feel that this is a good concept that I wanted to share and see how we as ReportOUT or how we as individuals can actually advocate for a more inclusive and intersectional environmental justice movement. I think we have to look at the interconnectedness between the social side of things and the environmental side of things as well. And this link, if we acknowledge it, then we try and put in place some mechanisms or some frameworks or some grants to actually ensure that hopefully such disparity will be reduced. I don't think it'll be gone, but I think what we can do is to reduce it to the best of our abilities. So this is something that I think we all have to be aware of, and I'm sure many of us are already aware of this. So in the intersection I wanted to highlight is that because of the previous slide and what I shared, there is actually an increased likelihood that LGBTQIA+ individuals in certain nations may actually experience isolation and face a heightened risk of violence or other forms of oppression. And why? Because the climate emergency affects, as I shared, everyone in the world in one way or another. Maybe some parts will be more than others, but it will affect everyone in one way or another. And so in a particular country, if there's more prone to the climate effects, for example, I believe certain areas such as Pakistan or Kenya, all these regions, if they're more prone to the climate emergency, then the impact that it does on the different makeup of the particular country or region would not be equal, because because in the country, basically in the region, there's going to be different people with different social equity. There'll be different policies based on the government that actually disadvantage certain groups of communities, and therefore these differences, these disadvantages will actually be exacerbated when the climate emergency comes and affect these countries. So I think that that's also what I wanted to reiterate from what I shared in the previous slide. And a good case in point that is actually the idea, is this link or this example on how housing conditions can actually exacerbate the situations that I actually shared on the previous slide. So a concept that I wanted to share is the idea of gentrification, which is a demographic and economic shift that displaces established working class communities and communities of color in favor of wealthier newcomers and real estate development companies. So basically, this point is just saying the idea of displacement is that maybe an individual or a community is actually forced out of a particular location because of certain unfair disadvantages. So and then that when they move to, let's say, the outskirts of a country, or they move to other regions where then aren't as stringent environmental regulations or protection, and if there are cases such as, let's say, a toxic pollutant, because maybe they have moved to a part which is near a manufacturing plant that has emit a lot of toxic because there's no environmental regulations, then the impact on them will be much more. And I clearly think that's unfair. And therefore, these are things that we have to keep a lookout for. And these are things that we have to address. So with climate change, with the climate emergency, more countries will actually be focusing on dealing with climate change. I mean, that makes sense because climate change is actually one of the top risks that I believe in the there was a risk report that I read that the climate emergency is actually one of the top 2 or top 3 risks that the world actually faces and the world actually acknowledges. And if the governments then focuses more on such concepts, such actual facts like the climate emergency, it means that there'll be less attention towards assisting the LGBTQIA plus individual rights. And that is clearly also not very fair. So in some parts, maybe politicians might even use the LGBTQIA plus individuals as an excuse or reason for the climate, which, I mean, I'm sure we all agree that doesn't really make sense. But if politicians say things a certain way, certain groups of the community might actually believe it, or due to fear-mongering techniques or those sort of things, and therefore it will even affect the community even more. So the point I wanted to share is that we have to acknowledge the nexus between the climate emergency, LGBTQIA plus individuals, and also the risk of persecution, and therefore put in place, or at least feedback, or at least come together maybe in community of practices to actually think of what are some frameworks we can actually propose to ensure that such things do not happen in our community. Yeah, I mean, to be fair, I don't really have an idealistic perspective, so I think it will take time for such frameworks or such mechanisms to be in place. But I think it has to start somewhere, and I'm sure somewhere around the world, there are some steps being done already. And I think that, but it's good. I think if there can be a consolidated approach to the end as well. So if anyone has any ideas or any experience in this area that you wish to share, always feel free to reach out to any of us in Report Out. Happy to have a chat.